Good evening, everyone. It's great to see a packed hall for this session, and I know a lot of people who've been talking about attending because they're excited about the topic because of the times that we live in. The lives of Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski sort of intersected quite often. They were both, of course, we know, the national security advisors in the United States. Kissinger went on to become Secretary of State as well. And they both have similar shared histories of how they actually came into the United States and what they did as naturalized immigrants in the United States. An interesting conversation to be talking about today as well. Both of them left a very deep, indelible mark on US foreign policy. They carved out extremely different approaches. We all talk about Henry Kissinger in this part of the world, his realpolitik, the need for a balance of power, the sort of adage that peace really is an absence of war, not a solution to conflict, things like that. While Brzezinski is known for his more interventionist approach, particularly when it came to the breakup of the Soviet Union and looking at national identities within the former USSR as a way to kind of engage on an ideological plane as well. Like I said, while their approaches were different, they both believed in the primacy of US geopolitics and the right of the United States to remain as a global superpower. So I'm not going to spend more time talking about the two men. I think you'd like to hear it from the authors. We'll get into the details of each of your books. They're both fascinating and they're both very different. Edward Luce, yours is a biography, a straight up biography using primary sources. The family gave you access to his diaries and his papers. Jeremy, you've written about Kissinger more in a thematic way, talking about how Europe should be learning from Kissinger's approach to foreign policy. So just to kick off the discussion, because of the way US foreign policy is being perceived globally today, we've seen action in Venezuela, we see talk about Greenland, we see talk about Iran. I'd like to ask both of you, if both Kissinger and Brzezinski were alive today, what would they make of what's going on um, in DC? Who wants to take that first?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they disagreed on a lot. They were strategically very different in how these two grand strategists, in how they wanted the Cold War to be handled. But as you point out, they were both products of an early Cold War, post-Second World War America that was hungry for knowledge about its new adversary. Remember, America had been isolationist up until Pearl Harbor. Now it finds itself as the global power in conflict with the Soviet Union, in ideological conflict with the Soviet Union, and thirsty for knowledge of Russianists, all kinds of specialisms so that they could better study their adversary. So it was a very meritocratic system that took immigrants, like these two men who never lost their accents. One died at 100, Kissinger, the other at 89. They never lost their accents. And Brzezinski's name, he didn't change his name, and it's still unpronounceable to a lot of people. You got it right. That was very good.
I read your book.
Yeah, but I didn't tell you how to pronounce it.
You did actually in the introduction.
Oh, you're right. I did a phonetic spelling. And then they rose in Ivy League universities that were in partnership with the federal government. Right. It's public-private partnership. So immigrants, foreign accents, expertise universities. It's the mirror image, of course, of Washington today. I mean, it's the exact opposite. There's a war on universities. There are every day another bunch of countries has its visas cancelled. 75 countries now cannot apply for visas. Expertise is, of course, considered to be a form of wokeism. The rule of law is woke. Expertise is woke. And so, although they were great rivals and they disagreed with each other and everything, on this I think they would agree that this is no way to go about making strategy. That's, I guess, what I would say, that they would be united on this point.
Jérémie?
Well, first of all, thank you, Maya, and delighted to be with you tonight. I think, as Ed described, there were two men with a strong intellectual and moral backbone prior to entering into power. And then I think it led them to be able to think their foreign policy in the long term. They were historians by background. So they were not thinking only of what is the next coup, the diplomatic coup, but what should be our foreign policy in 10, 20, 30 years. I think it's something that they had in common. The second major difference with today is that they were two men who were not seeing the world in a Manichaean way. They were understanding that the world is made of gray, and that very often diplomacy is a choice between very difficult options because both are imperfect. And I think it was also something that made them like similar. And finally, they were deeply aware of the importance of alliances. I think they had understood that the United States has not become an incredible and unique power in the 20th century because of its exceptional military economic power. We have seen in the history like many empires that had incredible power. I think what has made the US unique was its ability through Republican and Democratic administration to use this power with self-restraint and to decide to build alliances rather than subjugate and vassalize. And it's exactly the difference of what we are seeing today.
So I just want to ask you, Jérémie, because one of the ideas you sort of foreground in your book is that Europe today needs to learn from Kissinger's approach to realpolitik. You say that Europe has been trapped in this need for moral clarity on its foreign policy and it's become an impediment in the way it's been interacting with the world. But don't you feel that Kissinger's realpolitik approach was actually part of the problem with the way the rest of the world saw the United States?
So let's take a step back here. I think like what has struck me more and more when I was reading about Kissinger is that in fact he was a direct heir of a tradition of foreign policy realists like Metternich, Talleyrand, Castlereagh that shaped foreign policy at the end of the 19th century in Europe. And paradoxically, at the moment where Kissinger was bringing this realist and European foreign policy tradition in the US, it was the moment where Europe was turning its back to this tradition of foreign policy for obvious reason. Basically, many leaders were considering that this tradition had led the continent to two terrible world wars. But I think at a moment where now Europe is at the risk of exiting from history, of becoming just a witness to history, what is very interesting is that we should, I think, reconnect with this realist foreign policy tradition. But then, Maya, you ask, well, is this realpolitik basically amoral? And I think here I would make a difference between the concept of realpolitik that has been caricatured because it's now synonymous with like cynicism, brutality, Machiavellianism, while at the beginning when it was conceptualized in 1853, it was just a method of action based on a rational analysis of the circumstances. And there was nothing like amoral. And here Kissinger is an interesting figure because I completely agree with you, and we can enter into more detail on this. There are many of his policies that are extremely controversial, that had devastating consequences.
Yes.
But I don't think he was amoral. I think he had a ultimate moral goal, which was to avoid to have a world that would experience against chaos, which was at his time, at the time of the Cold War, the nuclear confrontation between the USSR and the US. And why? Because let's never forget that Henry Kissinger was born as a young Jewish German boy, that 13 members of his family died in the Holocaust, and that for him, order should always prevail over the chaos of the Nazi regime. And so I think like this is what led him to very often make the choice between order and justice. He wanted order to prevail, and sometimes at the detriment of justice. And so it's where we can challenge his policies, but I don't think it was amoral.
That's interesting that you say that because I think from our part of the world, I mean, Kissinger's views, particularly on the 1971 war and the US involvement there, is something that still rankles in public memory. So, you know, the amorality of that position perhaps comes into question. But yeah, you want to add something?
And just on this, I think like the controversies around Kissinger's actions are in Chile, in Argentina, in Latin America, are in East Timor, are in many parts of the world, of course, Cambodia. But I think for me, Bangladesh is, of course, a very, more than controversial, it's a moral and strategic mistake. And here, I think like it's probably one of the only foreign policy decisions where there was no rational argument behind the US position. Because of course, like Kissinger and Nixon would tell you today, well, our position on Bangladesh was justified by the need to maintain a strong relationship with Pakistan at a time when Islamabad was our way to build a bridge with China and to have this rapprochement with China. But I think like their behavior during this war was first driven by a personal hatred vis-à-vis Indira Gandhi, which was completely irrational. These two young men in Washington, D.C., were deeply insecure about being lectured by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, which led them to, and in particular Kissinger, to see the war in Bangladesh as a Cold War conflict, while it was absolutely not this. So I think it was deeply mistaken in terms of strategy.
So that's a very interesting segue, Edward, actually, when I come to you, because this framing of the Bangladesh war against the backdrop of the Cold War and spheres of influence was something that Kissinger possibly used to justify the way the Americans behaved with Indira Gandhi. But overall, for Brzezinski and Kissinger, their policy towards the Soviet Union, towards détente, towards how to deal with the Soviet sphere of influence at the height of the Cold War became a place where the two may have had tactical agreements, but saw it strategically differently. I mean, do you want to just elaborate on how the two men saw the approach of détente as sort of a solution or a way of being during the Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think Brzezinski and Kissinger's disagreements became pretty kinetic, kind of personal, and fundamental. Kissinger had studied, he's made his name as a scholar of partly, as Jérémie says, of 1815 Congress of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars and the four great powers, you know, Metternich being the key one, the Habsburgs, the British, the Russians, etc., manage the continent for the next century to 1914. So the 100 years of peace, stability, that key word. And so therefore Kissinger didn't really care about smaller people, smaller powers. And he applied this to the Cold War. And he said, well, the Soviet Union's going to be around forever. So and in this nuclear age, we have to minimize the risk of nuclear war. And therefore, let's just sort of balance, have an equilibrium. They have their sphere of interest, we have ours. And Brzezinski was a scholar of the Soviet Union, and he spoke Russian, unlike Kissinger, and he was Polish. So he had a pretty motivated perspective on Moscow. And he saw the Soviet Union as a Russian empire dressed in Marxist clothing. And he went there a lot and traveled there a lot, and he saw what he saw was an ossified system where people got promoted because of lack of talent, what he called reverse natural selection, and that this system's going to die. It's quite opposite to what Kissinger thought. It's not going to be around forever. This is a failed system. We are leaving it in the dust technologically. The only area it can compete is nuclear technology, nuclear weapons technology. So he fundamentally disagreed with Kissinger. And he felt that détente was actually subsidizing the Soviet Union. All kinds of trade credits were being given. And so he saw his role as hastening its unraveling. And the great Achilles heel that he kept talking about was the nations. There are all these nations that feel like they're ruled from a very Russified Soviet Union by Moscow, not just the captive nations, as they were then called, Poland, Hungary, but republics inside the Soviet Union do not feel Soviet. They don't speak a language called Soviet. They're told to learn in Russian, not in Georgian, not in Tajik, not in Armenian, not in Ukrainian. And we should just weaponize these feelings of resentment against their imperial overlord, and peacefully, not through war, except proxy war, of course, And Kissinger was a specialist at that, but Brzezinski was no stranger to it. There was a lot of, I'd say, immoral, proxy theaters that were used by both superpowers around the world, including then East Pakistan. But he got the Cold War right, I think.
But was he as determined about China, for example, as Kissinger was? Kissinger
They
believed
agreed on that.
in a tripolar world, as you argue. Is that the case with Brzezinski?
Kissinger wanted to use the prospect of America getting closer to China to keep the Soviets on side.
That's right, yeah.
Brzezinski went a whole hog. It had all gone wrong in the mid-70s. Mao was dying, and it was very personal. It was dependent on Nixon, Mao. Mao was dying, Watergate happened, Nixon's out. The whole China rapprochement thing, the Shanghai Community, was like basically waning. Under the Carter administration, Brzezinski drove this, no, we have to normalize with China. And it was purely a chessboard move. It was, and so that wasn't equidistance between the three great powers. It was, no, we're going to get China on our side. We both hate the Soviets, fine, let's recruit them. Yeah. That was very realpolitik.
Yeah.
And so Carter's great thing about human rights, which I think he meant and was sincere about, and there were no combat deaths, no American combat deaths in the Carter administration. I think it's the first and last time there's been a president where there's been no. There were 8 Americans who died in the Iranian desert in the failed hostage rescue attempt, but that wasn't in combat, it was accident. But there were plenty of foreigners who died on behalf of the ideological fight with the Soviet Union in the Horn of Africa, in Afghanistan. Of course, they invade Afghanistan during the Carter administration. So there was plenty of proxy wars going on and a lot of amoralism or immoralism there too.
In fact, one could argue that Brzezinski's take on how to deal with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the way he handled the revolution in Iran were 2 of his biggest sort of foreign policy mistakes.
Well, Iran was a blunder. On his own terms, Afghanistan was not. I mean, it was brutal towards Afghanistan.
Yes.
But it was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. So we've given them their Vietnam. And so on Brzezinski's measure, Afghanistan was not a mistake. Iran was a huge mistake, massively miscalculated. And if we read history, we wouldn't repeat it. But I suspect that people who are in power at the moment are not reading history.
Or your book, for that matter.
Yeah, they need to start with my book. Quite right. Thank you, Maya.
I wanted to ask both of you to reflect. I mean, yours, as I said, is a biography. Yours is a little different in the way it's written. But you spend a lot of time also unraveling the sort of, chaos and the relationship or lack of a relationship between Kissinger and Brzezinski. I mean, they know each other. They have some sort of interaction with each other constantly. Do they like each other? Did they like each other? Or did they not?
I'd be interested in Jérémie's answer, and I don't want to hog too much time, so I'll give you a very quick one. They were rivals and frenemies, but who were addicted to each other's company. They disagreed very bitterly on certain issues, and Kissinger, some of the same papers that has him calling Indira Gandhi what he called Indira Gandhi,
Yes.
and wishing starvation on India, etc., has him calling Brzezinski a total whore. The guy's a whore, he's on every side of the issue. And when those were released in the early 2000s, Brzezinski was called by a colleague of mine and said, what do you think? That your friend Kissinger called you a whore? And he goes, no, he meant bore. It was just taken down wrongly. They were bitter rivals, but when Brzezinski died, Kissinger wrote this letter saying, the world is now an empty place. I've got nobody to argue with, to Brzezinski's family, and broke down in tears. So, I mean, they were deep rivals and had very different perspectives.
Jérémie, what do you think?
No, I agree with that. I think they were incredibly competitive, but I think the fact of being competitive, it's also what has led them to be National Security Advisor, this kind of, and Secretary of State for Kissinger. I I think they were merciless in their fights during like the time when they were in power, where I would probably like say, just to get back on the question of detente, I think they had different visions. Brzezinski was definitely more knowledgeable than Kissinger on the inner weaknesses of the Soviet system, but I think Brzezinski's policies were permitted by what Kissinger had done previously. Because the US in 1969, when Kissinger arrived in power, is not at all the same as the US in 1977, and same for the USSR. In 1969, the US is still grappling with the Vietnam War. Sputnik happened 2 years earlier. There is a kind of overconfidence among the Soviet leadership, and I think because Kissinger will implement this policy of detente, because there will be the Helsinki Accords that will enable Brzezinski then to play on the basket of human rights, because there is this wedge created between Moscow and Beijing through the rapprochement with China, I think you can have a more assertive policy vis-à-vis the USSR, which would have been impossible in '69, I think. So rather than opposed, I would see them as complementary. And then on the relationship between these two men, I must say that I think that Brzezinski was probably a nicer man than Kissinger. Kissinger was incredibly brilliant, but also very manipulative, very seductive. And for me, one of the things that, and I think Ed would agree with this, was made a very strong difference between the two men is that Brzezinski was a man who, until the end of his life, was saying what he was really thinking. And he was not afraid of having his own judgment and taking strong position. Kissinger was always appealed by the desire to please. And I think in this regard, like, we should never forget that Kissinger has always at the heart of himself seen himself as a refugee. And it's very striking. This man has probably been one of the greatest diplomats of the 20th century. He had an incredible success in terms of his career path, but he was begging for recognition even when he was at the height of power. And like, which led him to, for instance, when Nixon like said anti-Semitic word in front of him, never challenged Nixon, which led him to be desperate and very something like very nearly funny in Kissinger's life, to mingle with like stars in Hollywood, etc. He was like, because he wanted to be accepted. And there is something very, very striking, an insecurity that has constantly accompanied Kissinger, and I think Brzezinski was far more secure about himself than Kissinger was.
I have to say something. I think I've told you this, Jérémie, but you did interviews with Kissinger, and I did quite a few interviews with Kissinger up till 3 months before he died. So he was already 100, but I did several in the years before for this book. And the first one, he goes, because he's the ultimate seducer. He always wants to please the person he's with. It's why he said to Nixon, he said anti-Semitic things to Nixon. He said something about, I wouldn't care if the Soviet Union put Jews in the gas oven. I mean, he went that far to please Nixon, who was anti-Semitic. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Anyway, what he said to me was slightly less controversial, which is, Mr. Luce, you are the best commentator in America. I read your column every morning. And I thought, well, I only write once a week, so shall I correct him? And I thought, no, I think he's got a point. He obviously sees something, you know, he's got, so even when you know you're being bullshitted, it works. And flattery, and Brzezinski, it gets you everywhere. Brzezinski had something of the Polish cavalry charge in him. If somebody disagreed with him, straight for the jugular. He'd make an enemy for life.
Oh, that's rough. Yeah. That is rough. Okay, but just before we open it up to questions, I wanted to ask you what you thought about bringing it back to today, and not US foreign policy alone, but I think the issues that have come up while I was reading both your books. One is about the immigrant and assimilation. We see that conversation in the United States as well quite a bit, and also in Europe. I recently, as I mentioned to you earlier, I read Giorgia Meloni's memoir, and I was struck by the conversation on assimilation and identity and, you know, xenophobic almost to some degree. So that's one. And the second, the question of the national identities within the Soviet Union being leveraged as a weapon and weaponized against Moscow. Do you think that that was a slippery slope, again, given the context of populism, nationalism, hyper-nationalism, xenophobia that we find the world in today, not just in the United States or in Europe, but in Asia and across the world, we see similar patterns of trying to sort of leverage and weaponize sentiment. Ed?
Yeah, I mean, so I did not write a hagiography of Brzezinski, but I will take his part on this thing. If you are involuntarily, I mean, and Indians should feel this, occupied by a foreign power, and that foreign power gives you no autonomy on what you can do, and it forces you to learn in that foreign power's language, and it imposes that foreign power's foreign policy and everything on you, then giving that doesn't necessarily make reaction to that hyper-nationalism or a sort of a virus. It's kind of natural for a group that's being occupied. So I think it depends on your perspective. He and many other people in the former Soviet Union saw it as the last great European empire.
Right.
And he did warn that the Russians would attempt to, when Putin said the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, he wasn't saying the end of Bolshevism was a tragedy. He was saying the end of the Russian Empire was a tragedy. And Brzezinski warned he will try to rebuild it. And that's what he's doing.
Yeah, we can see that today, in fact. Yes, absolutely. Jérémie?
I think on immigration, what strikes me when I look back at the US during the second part of the 20th century is that three of their foreign policy leaders and thinkers, Madeleine Albright, Brzezinski, and Kissinger, were first-generation immigrants from Europe. And I think it said a lot about the US as a country that was able, at that time, and I think it was part of what made the US unique, able to draw talents from everywhere in the world and give them the possibility to rise to the top. And I think like the day when the US stops providing this opportunity, either in foreign policy or in tech or in anything, it starts declining. First element. And and so I think like on the opposite side, Henry Kissinger was also a European tragedy in a way, because there is something tragic for Europe that someone as brilliant as Kissinger or someone as brilliant as Brzezinski have not served the European interest, but have served the US interest. And I think it said a lot about, on the opposite side, when Europe falls into nationalism, falls into hatred, falls into anti-Semitism, it loses the opportunity to have the best talents. And when I met Henry for the last time, shortly prior to his death, he told me, well, in your book, you characterize me as a kind of European tragedy. And he said, I understand why, but never forget one thing. A young Jewish boy from the middle class like me would never have had the opportunity in Europe at that time that I had in the US. And I think the question for Europe is that, would a Jewish from the middle class would have the opportunities now? Unfortunately, I'm not sure.
So before we open it up to the audience for questions, very quick comments from both of you. Since you interacted with both these men as you were writing or before you wrote, before they died, do you have any memories, anecdotes from your conversations that didn't make it into the book?
There's one thing, Brzezinski had a blind spot on India, because India didn't really loom that large in the biography. There isn't a huge amount, there's some about Carter dealing with the Morarji Desai government and then Indira Gandhi coming back and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and India's sort of fairly pro-Soviet stance on that. But the comment I didn't put in, which is something he didn't write down, but he said to me, I knew him a bit, was he had a sort of blind spot with India. And he wasn't prejudiced, I don't think, but he had a blind spot, and he said, well, you know, their prime minister used to drink urine every morning. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, did Desai used to drink his own urine? I said, yeah, but I don't think that's representative of, most Indian leaders. And he goes, yeah, I just found that really off-putting. And I thought, well, if I put that in the book, it's going to look like, but anyway, I'm now putting it out there, so maybe I should have put it in the book. But it sort of stuck with me. It's like, it was a departure from his normal sort of clear geopolitical mind. It was just something that stuck with him that I thought that wasn't worth including in a book, but was worth including in a public forum. So go figure my consistency.
Excellent. Jeremy?
A small anecdote, like, so last time I met Henry, we had a lunch in his house in Connecticut, in Kent, and so we had like 3 hours of discussion on Ukraine. It was 10 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, on various issues, etc. It was a very snowy day, etc. And at the end of the meal, like I had come with a Uber, but it's really in the middle of the countryside. You have no network, etc. And so his bodyguard told me, well, how will you go back at New Haven? And I say, well, I will order a Uber. And he told me, well, there is no Uber here. So he called one of his friends, who was a former policeman, and the guy arrived in the property of Kissinger with flags on his pickup of Trump. And I had spent 3 hours like talking about Kissinger, about grand strategy. And then for 1 hour, the guy who was driving me back was just explaining me that we should just bomb Moscow and like just put an end to the war. And I was like, it says a lot about America and 2 Americas in one country. So.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great. I'm going to open it up to questions. We just have about 10, 15 minutes, and I see many hands already. I'm going to request you all to please keep your questions and not have a long prologue before them, and just be brief so that we can get as many as possible. Go ahead, sir. I saw you, yeah.
Hi, my question is for Ed. Do you think, looking back, if Brzezinski and Kissinger were alive today, would they like to reassess how the West spectacularly, if I may say, misread China, allowing China into the WTO in 2001, making a bet that China will gradually reform politically and become part of the integrated global system? Was that a spectacular misreading on Kissinger's part in the broader US foreign policy system? Thank you.
And I think one of the things that Kissinger said, because they were both quite, in many ways, alien to the American tradition, in that they both, and Kissinger put it like this, believed in that history never ends, it goes on and on and on. There's no stopping point, there's no formula, there's no magic approach. And he said the other thing that he and Brzezinski shared was the knowledge of the thinness of civilization. This is fragile. This needs constant gardening and constant renewal. So I think, and I not just think, I know that they were both asked this question, because Brzezinski died in May 2017 and Kissinger in November 2023. So they had seen the change in China, and they'd seen the backlash against globalization in the West, in America in particular. I think both would say, look, we took decisions in the 1970s. You can't really, when you see consequences coming in the aughties, you can't really say that we're responsible. That other people have come in between that could have adjusted those decisions and changed the trajectory. And so I think they'd probably lay quite a lot at Bill Clinton's door. That sort of peak naive globalism of Clinton, that everybody who's integrated in the global economy will become democratic and want to become American and share our values. This sort of peak naive globalism is not something I would lay at Kissinger and Brzezinski's door. I'd lay a ton of other stuff at their door, though. And I agree with the premise of your question.
Let's take that lady right there. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, what was the difference in which Kissinger and Brzezinski view the West German flirt with Moscow? I mean, Willy Brandt's and Schmidt's Ostpolitik. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think like Kissinger and Nixon were deeply skeptical about Ostpolitik by Brandt. And what is very interesting is that you had at that time like a very strong connection between Pompidou, well, first de Gaulle and then Pompidou in Paris, and Nixon, who were deeply skeptical about Brandt. And there was also a very difficult personal relationship between Brandt on the one hand and these two leaders, like Pompidou and Nixon didn't trust like Brandt. I think there was also another dynamic that was playing here, which was like, it was not only the fear that West Germany would sell itself to Moscow and would basically threaten Western Europe and strategic US interest and Western European interest vis-a-vis Moscow, but it was also the fact that they were afraid that you had a new actor playing the game of detente. Like if we look back at detente, it started first by de Gaulle, who built bridges with Moscow. Then Nixon started to enter onto the road of detente, and then you have Brandt. And Brezhnev, who had perfectly understood this, was very well playing the game between the three and creating wedges between Bonn, Paris, and Washington on this.
Okay. That gentleman in the back right there, yeah. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Should we take a couple together and then maybe answer them together? Is that okay with you? So let's take 2-3 questions together. One, that at the hand at the back, two, and one more from the front. This lady here in the front, three.
Okay. Much as we may dislike what is happening right now from the US side in terms of foreign policy, but looking at the rise of the conservatives in Europe and the popularity that they are gaining through elections, and also the actions of US being determined within the framework of a policy, a national security policy which envisages a certain role of US, a certain logic of their actions, and believing that the current president is more honest in expressing the intentions behind the nation's movements and not as polished as the earlier presidents. So, do you think that we are going to see a continuation of this policy even after this regime leaves? It would be difficult for the dispensation in US to really walk away from the direction that the US has already taken.
Okay. Then, did you guys get the question? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so just hold on. We'll just take a couple together. Yeah.
Good day. So the question was that the 250 years of American DNA, right from its independence, saw coups, dictators, and anything undemocratic. So was Kissinger just a part of, or Brzezinski were just the result of that 250 years legacy, or were they slightly different? And also, did they play a role in the chessboard of the global sort of wider concept that we term the deep state? Thank you.
They play a role in the deep state. Okay, and there's one more question here, and then we'll take the answers. Just this lady in the front, right over here. Yeah. Oh, you have a mic. Go ahead.
Thank you for coming here for this session. Really pleased. The question is for Edward Luce. I've been reading your brilliant work and your retreat of Western liberalism that you've written. So the question is based on that. How much of Kissinger that you see is a reflection or opposition to the themes you've presented in Western liberalism?
Okay, so let's take them in the order that they came. You start, and then.
Okay. Can I work backwards?
Sure, absolutely.
Very talented questioner. You know, I'm joking. Thank you for your kind words. Let me just actually combine all the questions. There is a different way of looking at American history, this 250 years of history, which is the position America was landed in on December the 7th, 1941, with Pearl Harbor, was not one America invited. It had been isolationist, if you remember, in between the wars. There was a vacuum. Britain was no longer strong enough to impose Pax Britannica, and America did not want Pax Americana. And the vacuum, there was competition. And therefore, it had this role thrust upon it. It developed a taste for it. It became a kind of neo-imperial modern power, a very effective one that won the Cold War, but that nevertheless looks like, not just with Trump 2.0, but Trump 1.0, and then Biden in between, as more and more as an aberration, as a departure from the American position, which is that basically the American public don't have much appetite for constant adventures and bases all over the world and subsidizing allies. And therefore, I believe that Trump isn't a flash in the pan, or whatever the negative version of a flash in the pan. I believe he's a symptom of a bigger structural change, post-Cold War change that is going on. The West is no longer, the convergence of the rest with the West economically is not just a China thing, it's an India thing. And the weight of numbers means there is a permanent middle-class squeeze going on in the West, which could be redressed partly through much more effective redistribution and progressive tax rates, and taking on the real tech titans in terms of wealth taxes and things like that. Since the system seems incapable of delivering that, we're going to get more and more populism, more and more backlash against immigration, and more anti-globalism. And it would take a genius of FDR, sort of once in 100 years, political statesmanship and skill, for the Democrats to really turn back the tide, assuming one was elected assuming a free and fair election in 2028. So I do believe this is deeper than Trump. And I think that sort of covers all three questions.
Yeah, Jeremy, do you want to have a bash at the questions as well?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Ed. I was very struck. I lived in the US like the first time in 2007, 2008, and we were already feeling the war fatigue vis-a-vis the Iraq war, vis-a-vis the Afghan war. And also, I think like another thing that was a result of the Bush administration, Bush son, which was the way they had managed the financial crisis. And the feeling among many Americans that they had been betrayed by their elites, that the elites didn't have not taken the responsibilities they should have taken following the financial crisis. And I think it created a certain trend that, in fact, Obama already identified in 2008, because let's never forget that Obama was elected on an agenda which was, I focus on domestic issues. But because of the personality of Obama, we were reluctant to see it. And it's only with Trump first administration that we really started seeing it. But I think it's something that is long-term. So to answer your question, I think it will continue post President Trump, and it's something that is still underestimated. In particular, I come from a part of the world, Europe, where I think Europeans have been extremely slow and are still reluctant to see that the US we experienced under Kissinger, under Brzezinski, where despite sometimes differences, despite diverging views, you had an elite in Washington that was deeply attached to alliances, and that was, in the case of Europe, intimately connected with Europe for personal, family, cultural reasons. This US will never go back. And I think the rest of the world has to be aware of this.
And Europe and other allies, South Korea, Japan, have been, to some degree, infantilized by this multi-generational security umbrella. So this is a teachable moment. This is a growing up moment.
Do you think that where we are today in terms of US politics and foreign policy, I mean, this is a global inflection point, is it not?
So I was talking about this to somebody earlier. If historians look back on 2025, say, what is the most important moment in 2025? I think it was Trump meeting Xi Jinping in Busan at the G20 in South Korea and essentially submitting, folding his hand. China had a bigger bazooka than America. That will be in amongst all the sort of flooding the zone with shit and like Greenland and blah, blah, blah. I say that was a serious geopolitical hinge point.
Jeremy, do you agree with that?
I completely agree with this, but I think that, yes, this is a global trend, but the state of the play where we are is also fantastic for foreign policy experts or diplomats, because Brzezinski and Kissinger were both convinced that diplomacy is about creativity and about be able to construct little by little a new world order. And I think like you are at a moment where you need to build a new world order, you need to build new alliances. And so I think like, for instance, from a European perspective, it means that we need to build new relations, strengthen relations, for instance, with India, for instance, with other allies. And so we have to completely redesign our kind of intellectual and foreign policy software.
Finally, I'm going to take the last question here. We know that there is a need for strong strategic thinkers in Washington today, like long-term strategic thinkers.
Everywhere.
There is a need. Is there the space for them?
So, I mean, what makes up a strategic thinker or strategic thought is no mystery.
Right.
Go back to Sun Tzu or Kautilya or, von Clausewitz, go all the way through. It's knowing your enemy or your potential enemy and your friends, thinking like them, sleeping like them, dreaming in their language. It's the better to avoid conflict with them because you understand their trigger points. That is the core of any strategy in any culture at any point in human history. Again, I don't wish to stress the absence of those qualities in today's Washington, because I don't need to.
Right.
But if you learn a foreign language, you're woke. You're a girly man. That's not a masculine thing to do. Knowledge is woke. So a posh word is astrategic. Washington is in an astrategic frame of mind at the moment. A less posh description of that is this is strategic imbecility.
Fair enough.
Well, I think that when you think like Europe did and like the West did partly, then you can exit from history. Then the tragic of history has disappeared. Yes, you don't have any more strategic thinkers. You have pure politicians, you have people who have no moral and intellectual backbone. And I think personally, I decided to write about Kissinger because I think that the tragic of history is coming back. And so that we need desperately people who will be able, when they exert power, to have a lasting legacy, a long-term vision, because they have endowed themselves with this kind of intellectual and moral backbone. And so we definitely and desperately need strategies both in Washington, Europe, and other parts of the world. And I think, unfortunately, it's because history, with all its tragedies coming back, that we will have them probably.
Okay, I think we're out of time, right? Am I? Yeah? Okay, sorry. I was trying to push my luck over there because I know there are many more questions. But thank you all for being a wonderful audience, and thank you both. Congratulations. Please sign my copies of the book before you leave. I encourage all of you to read the 2 books. They were brilliant to go through. Different forms, as I said in the beginning, but definitely worth reading. So go ahead. Thank you.
The books are available with our festival bookstore partner, Crossword Bookstore, right across the Vedanta front lawn. We've also got a book signing happening right next door to us, outside, and you can also buy the books there. Thank you, Edward Luce, Jérémie Gallon, and Maya Mirchandani for this brilliant session. Thank you. To view this session and many more, you can all tune into the official Jaipur Literature Festival YouTube channel. I would also encourage all of you to please like it, share it, subscribe it.
Festival venue partner, Clark Samer. Inaugural reception partner, Rambagh Palace, Jaipur. Bookstore managed by Crossword. Supported by Teamworks, Fine Arts Society. Online bookstore partner, Amazon. Hygiene partner, Dettol, Banega Swachh India. Internet partner, Airtel. Media partners, Print Media, Dainik Bhaskar, Dainik Jagran, iNext.